Good evening, everyone. My name is Pauline McIntosh, and on behalf of St. Francis Xavier University, I would like to welcome you to the Topshee Memorial Webinar Series. StFX University and the Nova Scotia Federation of Labour acknowledges that we are gathered today in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territories of the Mi'kmaq people. We are grateful for the peace and friendship treaties, and we recognize that we are all treaty people. Before we proceed, please know that tonight's webinar will be recorded and shared on the organizer's social media channels. You may also note that live transcript feature on Zoom is activated, and you're welcome to use it. This event, the Topshee Memorial Webinar Series, is a partnership between the Nova Scotia Federation of Labour and the St. Francis Xavier University's Extension Department and Coady International Institute. The series is sponsored by Extension's Topshee Memorial Fund. This evening's webinar is the fourth in a series that highlights key issues facing Nova Scotia workers as our new normal emerges in the aftermath of COVID-19. The final webinar in our series will be held in November and will focus on issues facing women workers in Nova Scotia. The Topshee Memorial Fund was established in 1984 to honor the memory of Reverend George Topshee. Topshee was the director of the StFX Extension Department from 1969 until 1982. He worked to maintain close links to organized labor, cooperators, and credit unions. Topshee saw workers in their trade unions and consumers and producers in their cooperatives and credit unions as part of the same cause for social justice and economic democracy. The death of Father Topshee prompted leaders in the labor movement in Atlantic Canada to initiate the Topshee Memorial Fund. From 1984 until 2004, the StFX Extension Department hosted 18 memorial conferences with topics ranging from nature of human work to globalization, attracting an average of almost 300 people per conference. It is very fitting to breathe new life into Topshee's legacy by sponsoring this webinar series at this time. I would now like to call upon Danny Kavanagh, President of the Nova Scotia Federation of Labour, to bring greetings on behalf of the Federation. Danny?
Thanks, Pauline, and thanks a lot for moderating tonight's event. And thanks to Kelti and Yogesh as well for joining us, and to all our guests that have joined us online, as well as anybody from international perspective that has joined us as well online. We're very pleased that we have formed this partnership again with StFX and with Topshee, and we're looking forward to lots of great work between with us as partners in the coming months and weeks ahead. So it's an important work that we do to raise issues that are important for workers, and none can be any more important than the issue that we're going to speak to tonight. So thanks again, and thanks everybody for joining us, and enjoy the webinar.
Great, thank you, Danny. Before I introduce tonight's speakers, I will say a few words about the process. Each of our speakers will have 10 minutes to deliver their comments. I will ask members of the audience to type your questions into chat. As many of them as possible will be addressed in the open discussion following the presentations. Your mic will remain muted while we hear from our speakers, but may be opened for you to ask a question at the appropriate time. If you have a technical issue, please go back to the link for the webinar and rejoin the call. If you are experiencing other issues while on the call, please type them in chat to be addressed by Brian Lazuri, who is providing technical assistance this evening. And if possible, Brian will assist you. I am very pleased to welcome our speakers, Kelti Cameron, who is an International Solidarity Officer with CUPE National, and Yogesh Ghore, Senior Program Staff from the Coady International Institute. Let us first welcome Kelti Cameron. As mentioned, Kelti is the International Solidarity Staff Person at CUPE National, Canada's largest trade union. She has a Master of Social Work from Carleton University in Ottawa and has been a community and international solidarity activist for almost 2 decades. She spent several years organizing with the Immigrant Workers Center in Montreal. Kelti?
Great. Thank you. And thank you everyone for being here. And I'm seeing already I have an unstable internet connection, so I may need to turn my camera off shortly, but we'll see how long it will last here, hopefully. So yeah, let me just start by saying thank you for this opportunity to talk about global labor rights during COVID, and also to thank the StFX Extension, the Coady International Institute, and the Nova Scotia Federation of Labour for organizing this really important webinar. I'm really happy to be joining you on unceded, unsurrendered Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory, known as Ottawa. And to start, I think I think it goes without saying, but I'm just going to say it anyway. When we talk about labor rights, we're really referring to the basic protection and rights of everyone in the workplace. That includes health and safety protection, equal work for equal pay, fair compensation, wages, benefits, the right to organize, the right to association, and the right to collectively bargain. And the most effective and important way to ensure labor rights are realized and respected is through trade union membership, collective bargaining, and political collective mobilization. And so prior to COVID, I think it's important to start and just mention that prior to COVID, the situation facing workers around the world was pretty dire. And over the past few decades, we've seen a real global shift that's moved away from standard employment, as we would traditionally understand it, towards really insecure, precarious work. So this work is generally characterized by contract employment, temporary or part-time work with low wages, few, if any, benefits, little job security, little recourse when there are working conditions that are exploitive and unsafe. And, you know, throughout the past few decades, we've seen, you know, the proliferation of export processing zones and the multinationals using global supply chains and creating massive pools of cheap labor, poverty, unemployment, the climate crisis, war has forced now almost or more than 250 million people out of their countries as migrant workers in search of work. And that number is expected to rise. There's been a sharp increase in precarious forms of employment after the global economic crisis in particular in 2008. So that in 2015, only a quarter of the world's people, or world's workers, I should say, had a permanent contract for work. The rest were part-time, temporary, or self-employed. And now we're seeing the rise of what we call gig workers or self-employed independent contractors emerging all over the world. And that's not even mentioning the informal economies and the unpaid and labor and care work predominantly of women. And so the already growing precarity was not only driving down wages and working conditions and massively increasing the income and wealth inequality that we're all experiencing, but it was also undermining trade unions and the power of workers to organize collectively. And so that's all to say that the lowest paid, most vulnerable pool of workers around the globe, who are predominantly women, racialized from oppressed communities, were really hanging on by a thread at the start of the pandemic. And then what we saw, and I'm sure I'm not saying anything that hasn't already been observed widely, is that the COVID has really exposed the reality facing precarious workers and facing marginalized communities. And then on top of it, it's really intensified that already in dire situation. So what we see is poverty rates have risen sharply. So close to 100 million people have joined the ranks of the extreme poor, and 80 million more are undernourished, more than were before the pandemic. The International Labour Organization just reported it this year, that 255 million jobs have been lost, and global unemployment increasing by 33 million workers. And 80 million have already just left the ranks of the labor market altogether. And so presumably into the formal economy, into the unpaid care work, care sector, I should say. And they've also forecasted by the end of this year that they expected another 90 million full-time jobs would be lost. And so the global labor income has declined by almost $3 trillion since the pandemic began. And this loss of income is disproportionately impacting youth, women, racialized, and also lower educated workers. Informal workers' earnings have been cut in half, and migrant workers who, it's not only the labor standards violations and the lack of labor standards that migrants often experience, but also human rights violations are endemic in the sector. They've faced worsening conditions, including an increase in basic non-payment of wages or underpayment of the work that they're doing. And so for the first time, or I should say also, the first time in 2 decades, we've also seen a rise in child laborers. On the other hand, the speed and the scale of billionaire the speed and the scale of billionaires' growth is unprecedented. And Oxfam reported in 2021 that the beginning of 2021, the world's 10 richest men have seen their combined wealth increase by $500 billion. And so that's more than enough to pay for the COVID vaccine for everyone and to ensure that no one is pushed into poverty during the pandemic. And so likewise, the top financial institutions are reporting record profits and are benefiting from a tax system that is serving their interests. So, on the one hand, in this context, we're seeing the stark inequality and the lack of labor rights and poor working conditions, that were in existence prior to COVID. We're seeing that intensified. But we're also seeing those very conditions contributing to the spread of COVID. But at the same time, these same workers are being recognized for their value, and they're being seen for their immense value to society and to our very survival, our collective survival. So it is a contradiction that we're needing to grapple with. And precarious workers generally have multiple jobs, which contributed to the spread of COVID. We saw that in Canada in the long-term care sector in particular, but that was replicated around the world. Job security and poor working conditions were preventing workers from accessing personal protective equipment. That was a major issue in the health sector, sanitation workers, cleaners, transit workers globally. Migrant workers who care for our children, grow our food, had limitations on their ability to advocate for their right to PPE. Low wages and lack of sick days have prevented workers from staying home. And then, the same workers were applauded as being the heroes of the pandemic. So the popular refrain, an injury to one is an injury to all, which is, a popular refrain of the labor movement, has more deeply been understood, I think, by a large part of the population and the public, as has the collective understanding of how deeply our working conditions impact our living conditions. I think we've sort of understood that abstractly, but I think it's much more concrete. And that's presented a really important opportunity for the global labor movement, which I think we can discuss in the Q&A if people are interested. But I think I just want to touch to conclude on I think one of the most disturbing trends, in addition to the devastation of what I've just outlined, is the way in which governments have used the pandemic and the COVID restrictions as an opportunity to impose repressive and regressive legislation on the population, to target trade union activists who are agitating for safety measures in the workplace or who've been organizing in unions, who they violated collective bargaining rights and have criminalized leaders of trade unions and members for exerting the right to free speech and the right to organize. And so the trade union, the International Trade Union Confederation, the ITUC, puts out a global rights index every year. And in 2021, this year, they recorded an all-time high on attacks on the right to strike and the right to establish and join trade unions, as well as an increase in arbitrary arrests and detentions and the denial of free speech. And so just want to highlight really briefly a couple examples. And these I'm drawing from examples that CUPE has experience with, but also through the Global Union Federations. One is in Zimbabwe. At the start of the COVID crisis, the government arrested 13 nurses who were protesting their deteriorating pay and working conditions. And that led to a strike by the Nurses Association. They were later released on bail, but it did require a significant amount of international solidarity and pressure and support to have them released. Another important example is what's happening in the Philippines during the lockdown. Lockdown was highly militarized, but they passed anti-terror legislation right at the start of the pandemic, and then went on to use that legislation to tag organizers and activists in the trade union movement and other sectors as being, enemies of the state and terrorists, and went on to put leaders under surveillance, detained several leaders, and many have been murdered. And then the final example I want to draw attention to is Colombia. Colombia has a very tense social uprising over the past year, and that was as a result of regressive legislation that was imposed on the population. The trade union movement's been out front, and actually a trade union leader and union that CUPE Nova Scotia has a long-standing relationship with, Centraco Valle, the Water Workers Union, that the leader had her national protection security withdrawn at the beginning of this year by the government, despite having death threats and harassments brought against her by the paramilitary. So, I think I would like to go into some of the global trade union responses. I think that's an important aspect of this. I'm a little bit over time, and what I will just say very briefly is that the trade union movement are doubling down on a lot of the campaigns that they've already been engaged in around tax justice and investment in social programs. Public sector unions have identified the role of the government, the role of social investment, the importance of the care sector that is emerging, and this is a real opportunity to raise the profile and to call for fundamental reorganization of care and the way that we organize our services in society. Organizing efforts are increasing. There's a renewed interest by members and workers to join unions in light of the fact that they've come to understand there is a real value of having this collective protection. And also with the face of the increasing violence and repression, coupled with the isolation of COVID and the lack of our ability to travel, really does require an escalation or an intensification of international solidarity, and that's an important role of the international labor movement to engage and communicate some of the most urgent needs coming out of the movements. So So I'm going to stop there, and I went through it a bit fast, and I'm sorry if I'm over time, but I'm happy to have questions and discussion after. Thanks.
Well, thanks so much, Kelti. It's quite a grim picture that you've painted for us, but one that we absolutely need to be aware of and need to think about how the trade union movements can help combat some of the devastation that's happening and has been truly exacerbated by the pandemic itself. So I look forward to hopefully having some of that conversation in the discussion period. So thanks again for bringing that perspective. It's incredibly valuable to hear. I would now like to invite Yogesh Ghore to open his mic. Yogesh is the Strategic Partnerships Advisor and Senior Program Staff in the thematic area of Inclusive Economies at the Coady International Institute, where he facilitates the Institute's educational and training programs, research and knowledge building initiatives, and capacity strengthening efforts globally. Yogesh, welcome to the webinar.
Thank you, Pauline. And I'm a colleague of Pauline's and a good friend. So you sound very formal, Pauline. I'm just Yogesh. Welcome, everyone. So nice you could join. And thank you, Danny, as well. And thank you, Pauline. And I'm sure, I think Anthony is listening to this. I don't see him in the participant list, but I think he's with God. So thank you, Anthony, for restarting this in the online format. I'm so happy to join you all today. So I think Kelti has provided a nice overview globally what happened during the pandemic to the labor rights. What I'm going to talk about is just provide some high-level points around the condition of workers on the ground, mostly in the global south, and highlight some of the contrast that you may see when you compare their condition to what we see here in Nova Scotia and in North America more generally. So the first one, I would start with with the divide between the people who could work and people who could not work. And similar to here, there were people who were able to switch to remote working because the nature of their job allowed it, because they had a relationship with the employer, so they were able to switch, and they had the tools and connectivity to move their work online. So a lot of that happened in the global south as well. Similar to that, just like here, there were people who kept working because their work became essential, like the healthcare workers here, like the grocery workers here. Similar thing happened there as well. In fact, a lot of their work, like the health workers, their work got multiplied because there were multiple waves and huge numbers. So the doctors, nurses, they were overworked. So my brother is a doctor back home. They were just like working day and night. They had their regular job, but on the top of that, all the COVID work. So in terms of their rights, I mean, their work got increased. And they were exhausted. And as soon as I think, particularly in India, for example, the first wave ended, and after barely when they were ready to sort of take some rest, the second wave came, which was much more vigorous than the first one. So that's like people who were able to work. But then there are people who were not able to work because of the lockdowns. So the difference here is that here, I think after the lockdown, people who lost their jobs started getting payment, the sub payment within a couple of weeks. So in terms of the real hit, and there can be improvements in SERB, there might be gaps, but at least people were able to get some income. They were able to maintain the living standard. They had certain income coming in. But when we compare this to people who lost their jobs in the global south, that social protection was missing. They had nothing to fall back on. And that's where we saw many people, particularly the workers who had migrated from rural areas to urban areas. We saw millions of them going back to their villages. And this was particularly huge in India, where over 10 million people, literally, because the trains were stopped, the buses were not running, these people literally walked on their foot, taking their luggage on their head for 100, 200, 300 kilometers. And so that's what happened during the pandemic, because they didn't have the adequate social protection. So their rights as workers, simply they were not able to exercise. They had to just leave. And in many places, these workers working in urban settlements, often they live. So for example, if you're a construction worker, you live near the construction site, you have a little tent, or sometime if you have made one floor, you just like live there. So once the lockdown happened, they had nowhere to go but to go back to their villages. So that social protection, I think, where some basic income, that was missing. The second thing that that we saw, and this again is globally. So the World Bank, earlier this year, they came up with a report, their annual report titled Reversal of Fortunes. And in that, they came up with a new phrase called new poor. So who are these new poor? So these new poor are people who were educated, who were living in urban areas, and who had jobs either in the services sector or manufacturing, processing and all. So they had their jobs and they were above poverty. These people, when they lost their jobs, and again, these are in emerging economies, countries with higher income, they have lost their jobs in millions. So the World Bank says it's about 150 million people have went back to poverty. So these are the new poor. And they lost because, again, they lost their job and they didn't have that social protection. And the biggest challenge now, how do you get these people who were already slightly better off doing, they had their jobs, they were educated, how do you get them back into the workforce? That's the challenge just posed by the pandemic. The third one, I think, when I compare the workers here, the economy here with some of the economies in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, mostly in the global South, is the nature of work. So Kelti was talking about here, the economy is getting more and more sort of informal now. There's more gig economy. If you look at global South, that's what 80 to 90% economy, 80 to 90% of the work, that's how people make their living. ILO says around more than 80% of the workforce works in the informal economy. So that's a big difference. Here we have formal employment. People have contracts. There is job security. But when you are a worker in the informal economy, you don't have a regular income. You don't have any social protection. You don't have any benefits. So that's another sort of a contrast. So during the pandemic, many of these informal sector workers, because they are not formally recognized for any support, so they also suffered a great deal. The final, I would say, and then I actually want to end with some sort of our work that we are doing and some of our partners, where some of these most marginalized workers, how they were able to actually support those who were suffering because of the pandemic. But before that, I think the fourth contrast was around women workers, whether they were unpaid workers or women workers working in the care economy at the household level, or whether they were working for income and had formal jobs. In both the cases, in many places, what we observed that majority of women workers were the frontline workers, where either their jobs because of the lockdown were gone, or they had to continue because they were the essential workers. So they were actually suffering in both the cases. Whereas for the women working at the household level, many cases where the gender-based violence increased because the returning husband or returning man, they had nothing to do because there was strict lockdown. So there were incidences of higher gender-based violence. Now, what provided women peace in that kind of environment at the household level? What we found out through our work with the Self-Employed Women's Association in India, it's one of the biggest trade union in the world, certainly one of the biggest in India. What was interesting for us that it was easier for women in the lockdown condition to go and find work as compared to men. So if you are a vegetable farmer, you had your vegetable and you take that vegetable and you want to go sell door to door, the police, they were less harsh to women than they were to men. So women actually, in many cases, became the bread earners during that lockdown period, and they were able to find peace in the work. So work was a healer for them. This is what we learned. Also, I think what we found out that the most marginalized workers, like women, they came together. For example, in Seva, they came together early on in March, April, to come together and start producing masks in huge quantities. So they produced, I think, over 20 million masks and distributed among their membership and also to the small town hospitals and other places, so that people have access to these masks and also spread awareness about the pandemic. So imagine the same people who are informal sector workers, marginalized, they came together as the first responders because they were rooted in the community. They knew where the most vulnerable were there, and they were able to provide that support. So I think when I really look at the condition here and there, obviously the social protection was missing in terms of the rights there. Therefore, I think, and given that here there's increase, as Kelti was saying, there's increased precarity here. The size of the gig economy is increasing, so work is getting more and more informal. So I think, and if workers are facing the same issues as I described, the workers facing in the global South, then there is a need for building global solidarity. So a lot of the work that our partners are doing now of the labor movement is around universal social protection, that each worker should be protected. So I think a global solidarity around building that universal social protection is key, and that applies to formal sector workers, but also the increasingly informal workers as well. So I hope I haven't crossed my time, Pauline.
Not at all, Yogesh. Really happy to hear your comments. My goodness, it's you've really captured well for us the difference between the North and South, and the profound impact of not having a social protection of any kind for workers during the pandemic and prior to, of course, particularly with regard to the informal economy workers and the people on the front lines. Thank you so much for giving us that great capture of what's happening in that context. I'm seeing that there is a question from Ian Johnson in the chat. It says, are there standard protections or guarantees all unions should be seeking at this time or in the future? Should we be looking for common protections in collective bargaining at this time? So Kelti, I wonder if perhaps you want to take the first crack at this question, and then we'll see if Yogesh has a comment as well.
Sure. Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, my starting point, if we want to go really high level global, in terms of labor rights recognition, I would note that there is a push by the global unions at the level of the ILO to have health and safety conventions recognized as part of the short list of core labor protections. So, and that's really an escalated push right now, that health and safety should be considered a core labor convention. So provisions around health and safety in the workplace right now, I think, and that would look different depending on, you know, where you are in the world and what your workplace is, of course. But you know, I think that would be the standard starting place from the local level in your community, and you know, if you're in Nova Scotia, right up to the global International Labor Organization level. And I would also say provisions around sick leave. You know, usually collective agreements. It's often the labor standards. You know, basic labor standards for workers that don't necessarily have a collective agreement, where there's now a big push and call for more like 10 sick days as opposed to 2 or 3. You know, sick leave has become paid sick leave has become an increasingly important benefit or provision in labor standards. And then just also recognize and just reinforce that recognition that there's provisions in the collective agreement, but also making the difference between the labor standards, so that we're paying attention to both the workers who are unionized and then the workers that are not unionized, and ensuring that these provisions are provided, that we're considering both. Obviously, we want workers to be organized into unions, but where they're not, we want to make sure the basic labor standards, we're raising the floor there.
Great. Thanks, Kelti. Yogesh, is there anything you would add?
Yeah, I think, yes, there is a need for universal social protection. And I think, yeah, the global labor movement should actually advocate for that, absolutely. But I think, you know, as more and more the economy becomes a gig or more informal work, more precarious work, then each worker is sort of becoming a self-employed enterprise, right? So they are their own contractors, right? Or they have very short-term contracts. So in that case, these self-employed individuals, if they are in a union, yes, they can bargain as together. But if they are not, in that case also they are micro entrepreneurs. They should be protected. So in a lot of our work, what we are observing, that, you know, this pandemic was like a earthquake that shattered everybody, right? But in many cases, workers work, for example, smallholder farmers. Okay, they have their micro enterprise, whether you call it or not, right? And they, every now and then, with the increased climate change, every 2-3 years, either there is a drought or there is a flood, and whatever progress they make in 1 year, it takes them right back into poverty, because so they feel these tremors every now and then. For us, this was a once in 100-year event, the pandemic, and got everybody's attention. But there are small tremors that affect these people every year or after a couple of years. So what's the protection for them? So a lot of our partners are actually are asking for a resilience fund, a livelihoods resilience fund, so that after each shock, there is a fallback option that you can go back and get that support. So how you create that kind of build resilience so that people can have something to fall back on. So yes, protection in different ways is required.
Okay, and Yogesh, we have a question here from Gord Cunningham, and Gord's asking, how can unions help organize informal sector workers around the world? And maybe I'll give this one to you first, and then perhaps Kelti might add to it later on.
Yeah, I think God knows the answer. I mean, him and Anthony, they started Coady's relationship with one of a very innovative and one of the biggest informal sector worker organization in the world. And I think here, I think when we talk about union, you have to have a formal job or you're part of a trade, and then you become part of a union, right? But in case of Seva, these are informal sector workers. So you could be a street vendor, you could be a smallholder farmer, you could be a rack picker, and you are an individual micro nano entrepreneur. So what Seva has done is to bring them together. Because individually, so Seva's founder, Ila Bhatt, she wrote a book, and the title of the book is We Are Poor, But So Many. So as individual, you can be poor, but your strength comes when you come together. So by coming together, you get the identity of a worker. Then okay, so then you are recognized that you are a worker. So that's why that is important. So examples are there like Seva, and I think the global community can learn from examples like that. That okay, a most marginalized woman worker working 8 months of the year in the dry deserts of Gujarat, when they can come together, other workers can come together. But it requires a lot of solid work on the ground, a lot of organizing, and letting these people actually take the lead in doing that. So yeah, but what is needed is how these different movements come together to build that global solidarity is what God is talking about.
Great. Thank you, Yogesh. Kelti, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I think it, I just would echo the point. It is collective political or collective mobilization and organizing. Whether you're in a municipal workplace, a city, or if you're in the informal communities. I was just drawing on some examples that I have been involved with different unions where, for example, in South Africa, the Municipal Workers Union was working to organize informal, what they call themselves waste pickers. So they were the workers that would go to the do the recycling. And so the union itself was going and trying to engage and organize with the informal workers to try to find creative ways to both collectively organize the workers themselves, but also potentially bring that service into the public sector. So that's one example. Other examples are urban poor communities that may be comprised of a lot of different informal workers doing different jobs, but they're being organized around their social conditions in the urban poor communities, which is directly linked to their precarious work status. So there's some examples of that kind of community-based organizing that draws in the working conditions, but isn't necessarily sort of workplace based.
Yes.
And then, the unions themselves work in alliance with different community-based organizations. So it's the alliance work that becomes particularly important in that respect. You have the labor movement, trade union movement, working alongside the community-based urban poor communities, working alongside the rural agricultural communities that are all organizing around the issues of importance, but are working on cause in terms of their own strength building and power building in terms of their mobilization. So there's no easy answer to that question, but no quick fix to the one-on-one organizing that has to take place.
For sure. Thank you both. One of our listeners is asking whether our guest speakers could talk about Canadian corporations' action internationally regarding jobs leaving Canada and human rights abuses, worker rights, etc. Yogesh, would you like to kick this one off?
Can you repeat it? What's the organization?
Asking about Canadian corporation action internationally with regard to jobs leaving Canada, human rights abuses, and worker rights.
Yeah, jobs leaving Canada means jobs offshore. Yes, that's going to be and more and more with technology, with future of work. It's going to be a global workforce, and I think more and more as you sort of divide your jobs into different tasks, and if those tasks can be done from anywhere, and that is already happening. And I think that is both I would say a challenge and also an opportunity, because if the work becomes global, and if there are workers available who could do that task that was originally done here at much cheaper cost, then that is what is going to happen, and that's that's a reality I think we have to be ready for, because more and more it becomes a global workforce. So you now open up websites like Upwork. You can find somebody who's willing to do your work in maybe $10 per hour, the same that you pay here $30 an hour. So why the people who need that service would rather go there? So yes, that is definitely one area where we will have to, Canada here will have to prepare how to actually look at that. And the other one is the aging population here, and that also requires that you look at your immigration and other things. How do you actually balance that? So it's both. It's like work going outside, but also what happens here in terms of the workforce.
Right. Thanks for providing that perspective, Yogesh. Kelti?
Yeah, a couple things come to mind. I mean, when we think about Canadian corporations, I think we think about the mining industry and the human rights violations and the labor rights violations. If we think about outsourcing and jobs that, the one thing that comes to mind when outsourcing in the textile industry became popular amongst the multinational corporations. There was an example in Montreal where Gildan Activewear, which was a t-shirt factory, moved to Honduras, and they moved to Haiti, and they moved elsewhere. And when they moved from Montreal to Honduras, they were unionized here in Canada, and that work was lost, and the jobs were taken in Honduras. So one of the things that we did, and we worked with an organization, an NGO in BC, CODEV Canada, to make the connection with the workers that were then going to be working for Gildan Activewear in Honduras. And the idea is, we could be angry here that they've taken our jobs, or we lost the jobs here, but we're losing sight of who the problem is if we take that position. And so the idea was that we would work with those workers to raise the bar, raise the floor, and help them to organize themselves into unions, and help them to ensure that their working conditions, and support their self-organizing. And we've continued for the last 20 years to do that. And they've done a lot of really important work around occupational health and safety, and trying to reorganize the way the work is done, in an effort to, ultimately the goal is like creating the conditions that the companies have nowhere to go to exploit cheap labor. And so that's sort of one concrete example. And the only other one I want to raise, because it's a more recent example, is a situation here in Ottawa where the taxi dispatch was outsourced to the Philippines, a call center in the Philippines. And so one of the things that we tried to do was identify exactly where that dispatch was, and have conversations with the workers in those workplaces, because they were really clear, and we did find them. We found the exact location. We were able to find the place where they were outsourced, and try to have an exchange to talk about, they're clear, we don't want these crappy jobs either, but we need work, and have that exchange so that the workers here who are out of work have an understanding of the global dynamics of this system of exploitation, and then try to address it through collective organizing. And how can we work together to do that? And so those are some micro examples, but they're what they are. And the only other, I just want to also
Sure.
Bangladesh, because we've got multinational corporations, Canadian companies going to Bangladesh, exploiting the workers. And there's a lot of efforts in Bangladesh now, particularly in the textile industry, to set up global funds they call the severance funds, because a lot of the workers during COVID, because of the nature of the way that these companies contract to subcontractors who then don't pay the workers when they lose the contract during COVID. And so there's all these workers who've been working and they haven't received their wages. So there's this whole pay your workers campaign, but it's about holding accountable. So it's not necessarily that the workers here in Canada have lost their jobs to the workers in Bangladesh, but it's the Canadian companies that have subcontracted, which maybe traditionally would have been work that's happening here in Canada. And now they're basically just, throwing them under the bus and just letting them lose their wages. And again, this is a country with no social protection. There's no, so we're looking for ways to hold accountable again. And again, part of that is Canadian regulations. So.
Great examples. It really illuminates the underlying or underpinning issues that are part of that whole situation. Thank you. We have a comment. Thank you all for this wonderful information. My question is, if you are experienced on India and other parts of the world, how about the poor countries that are not in access of any paid jobs? How they are protected in terms of their health in this pandemic? Do they have access to COVID-19 vaccines? And what about countries that are not unionized to CUPE? Are they being considered in terms of labor rights? So I don't know which of you would like to address that one first.
Yeah, no, I think it's health-wise. I mean, it affects everybody. Like, so it is a global pandemic. The health impact are obvious. And I think, and we know world over that it has affected people with underlying conditions, and especially those who couldn't afford healthcare, right? So the health pandemic was always there, but I think in many places, particularly in the global south, so along with the health pandemic, the economic and the social pandemic was far more sort of devastating and with long-term consequences. And I think if the question is just about health, yeah, in many countries the health budget is less than 1% of the GDP, less than 2% of the GDP. So the health system is under so much stress. So a pandemic like this just overwhelms everything. Right. So in many countries, we didn't find that there was enough testing. That's why the numbers were so low. Right. So in general, the health infrastructure is under stress in many of these countries. So the pandemic has just it has just overtaken everything. But along with that, I think so. Yeah, that problem lies in terms of the access to health. So even now, I think if I talk about India, which has done very well in terms of vaccine manufacturing, over 1 billion people have got their first dose, and over 300 million people got their second dose, which is quite good. But if you look at Africa in general, I think it's about 3% now. So there you are. The access to vaccine is a huge issue, because Africa doesn't manufacture the vaccines, right? It has to come from elsewhere. So there's a lot of inequity in terms of access to health.
Yeah, for sure. We have one final question that we're going to take this evening, and it is from Alan Linkletter, who was instrumental in planning this workshop this evening, this webinar. And Alan is wondering if you can tell us a way that everyday people can promote and educate people about workers' rights within Canada and other countries. So Any
local.
quick tips? What was that, Yogesh?
Buy local.
Buy
Where-
local, buy local.
Where you know that somebody's
Yeah.
paying your worker good or not.
Yeah.
Uh, But I think, having more consciousness about what you are buying. But it's all about social contract. So the companies who produce things, it's just not about what they produce. It's about who they employ as well and how they treat it. So they create a social good besides what they produce. They create a social good in terms of the number of people they employ and how they take care of it. And if we move away from that, then everybody will have a problem. So as consumers, I think that's what we have to ensure, that social contract. We have to bring back that social contract.
Thank you, Yogesh. Kelti, what would you offer for the everyday Canadian who is trying to contribute to improved conditions for workers worldwide?
Yeah, I mean, I think just to use an example right now that maybe I wouldn't have used 6 months ago or a year is just the discussion. And I saw it in the comments around the CERB we have in Canada, and how, the question of whether, why aren't people going back to work? Are they getting paid more on the CERB? And so I think that's a really good segue into a discussion about, is it because the CERB is too high or because wages are too low? And I think that's an important discussion that's taking place right now. In terms of, I'm lost where I was gonna take that, because the access that we're in, the situation that we're in with COVID has a lot to do with the working conditions of people around the world and the inequality. It's the inequality that I think is the most stark. And so that's actually where I was going to go with this, is that, we talk about the COVID vaccine, and, a lot of the issues that we're facing now is because it's controlled by the large pharmaceutical companies. It's a market-based solution to it as a public health problem. And, I think we have to be really talking about and questioning, why are all of these services and basic needs being provided for profit when they could indeed be provided, by the governments and not be preventing people's access. So, for example, the access, to the vaccine globally. India is a perfect example where they were exporting more of the vaccine for profit than they were actually at one point being able to distribute to their population. And so, I think the best way to have that conversation is, and I always say that as workers, we have more in common with workers in other countries than we do with the elite in our own country. And so just sort of removing this idea that as Canadians, we all stand together with Canadians, we have to think of ourselves in terms of our class, and think about how we relate to workers in other countries. And by having conversation about who's profiting, whose interests are being served, I think it's a good starting point. That was sort of a convoluted, bringing in a whole lot of not the most articulate way to answer that question, but that sort of, who benefits and why are basic public services and public health solutions being provided for profit, I think is a good conversation to have.
Kelti, you're just starting to break up at the very end, but I think you were leaving us with some great questions for reflection, for our own thinking and situating ourselves in the global context, and helping us, giving us some guidance to do that very thing. So thank you for that. This has been a wonderful opportunity for learning this evening. We will gather again in November to continue this important exchange. So please keep an eye open for an invitation to register, which will come to you via social media. I would like to express my sincere thanks to Kelti Cameron and Yogesh Ghore for being with us this evening. Your insights have been profound, and you've given us lots to think about as we consider what our new normal could look like for Nova Scotia workers, but for workers all over the world as we regroup in preparation for the post-pandemic days. So thank you so much for that. I would also like to thank the people behind the scenes who've made this webinar possible. The committee chairs from the Nova Scotia Federation of Labour who've been working to support these webinars since the series began. Rocky Beals, Anne McCullough, Hugh Gillis, and again, especially Alan Linkletter, who played a key role in organizing tonight's webinar, along with Nicole McKim and Danny Kavanagh and Joan Wark, who continues to provide great communications support for the webinar. I'd also like to thank Coady's communication team, Brian Lazuri, who also provided technical support here this evening, Stu Hawks and Jenny McDonald. And again, I would like to acknowledge the Topshee Memorial Fund's sponsorship of this event. Finally, I would like to thank all of you for joining us this evening for this important discussion. Your interest is appreciated and needed to create better workplaces for all. Thank you, and I hope to see you in November. I am Pauline McIntosh from the StFX Extension Department, wishing you a good night.